So you wouldn't believe what it's taken for us to get here tonight, but I won't bore you with all that. Welcome to Gaming the System, the feminist podcast where we look at gaming through a feminist lens and feminism through a gaming lens. And tonight it's myself, Jem, and Matt and Alex joining you to talk about gender in horror games. Well, we were going to have an intro thing, but we feel that we've got a lot going on this evening, a lot to get through. So we're going to just dive straight in, and then we might take a brief interlude at the end if we have time. Halloween has been and gone, and hopefully everyone had a good time and didn't eat too many sweets. Hopefully you got to see some of our games, fun and games playing Little Hope. But we thought rather than say farewell to the spooking the system, we'd have a look at gender in horror games. When I was thinking about this topic, I was thinking about initially we were talking about women in horror games, and I thought, well, yes, but a lot of the issues that come up for women in horror games are the same issues that come up throughout most of our gaming discussions. So we talk a lot about, what they're wearing, what they're doing, all of that. So I wanted to see if we could come at this from a slightly different angle this evening. But obviously we still need to discuss those issues because they are quite fundamental. With that in mind, I was wondering what you two feel are the core issues around gender in horror games at the moment for you. When you think about this topic, what comes to mind? And I'm going to go with Alex first.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I'm probably the least qualified of all of us to talk about horror games, but I'm going to give it a crack because it's my least favourite type of game, and I've played very little horror in my lifetime. But from that perspective, I can say that what I tend to think of as horror games, usually the woman is a figure of either someone who's in extreme distress or someone who's been overly sexualized or hypersexualized, or also is in fact the villain of the piece, but uses the fact that they're a woman to kind of entice or lure or otherwise kind of uses her assets, quote unquote, to get her way and such like.
Her particular set of skills.
Yes. Yes. But that's a very, very sort of narrow perspective because, as I say, I'm no expert on horror games because I just can't play them. So perhaps I don't know if obviously there are men that hate horror games as well. I know a few, but it's interesting to think about the audiences the gender split in the audiences that play horror games as well, and whether that has any impact on what content you're getting out of them as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually, Alex. And I hadn't thought about that while I was thinking about this topic. And I think that the gender split, who plays the games and therefore who are they designing them for is always an issue, isn't it, for us? And so, I think, that's something that would be really interesting to know, actually. I'll have to look up the stats on that. Yeah. So, Matt, what do you think? What do you see as the core issues around horror games?
Well, I won't spoil what one of your topics of discussion is going to be later in the show that you shared with us earlier, but I think it does come into the frame the juvenile feel and atmosphere around women, and particularly women in horror games. But if you think about the horror genre in like a wider frame of reference, so including TV and film, there are very few highbrow horror movies. Horror film movies and TV shows are always meant to be just something like small and not very prestigious. And that has meant that they don't take themselves too seriously generally. So then that's when they come into very, very common schlocky archetypes, one of which I have a picture that I gave you, Jem. Were you able to upload them?
Yes, I was.
It's the picture with, it's a collage of 4 different pictures.
Yeah, here we go.
So these are 4 different games over the course of 15 years. And you'll see that the skinny, blonde, beautiful woman is still the centerpiece of so many.
She actually
games.
looks like the same character. I thought that this was a progression of the same character when I looked at this. I didn't realise they were different games.
Yeah, so that's exactly the point. So it's the reductive nature in which these women are created, and there was a lot of juvenile stuff going on in the horror genre.
Yeah, well, as you said, we will come back to that because I think there's another layer to that. So do you think that, Matt, I'll come to you first, do you think that women are getting a raw deal in horror games in comparison to other genres? I mean, we feel that they're getting a raw deal across the board in some respects, but do you think that it's more or less of an issue within horror games?
I think it's like, well, on the march of progress is painfully slow and long, and the less high, I think that in this case, the less highbrow you are, the slower the progress is, because there's less, by the nature of there is less depth in a lot of particularly horror things. And so the women get only the slightest fragment of depth normally. So when, if you think, most films are a swimming pool, and most horror films are ponds, and of course the man has to take up most of the space in the pond with his ego, and so women just get from an already compressed state. They are compressed further.
I think the point that you make about the lowbrow sort of topic storylines, I think is really valid, and I think it's something that I've always found really frustrating, because I do like spooky, scary stories. You know, I've always been interested in ghost stories and all of that sort of supernatural stuff. I don't like splatter gore, and I I did actually want to say that, you know, I do want to put a little bit of a warning on this episode, because we might be showing some imagery that's a little bit gory, a little bit, you know, nothing too bad, but obviously the topics that we talk about are quite violent and quite scary. But I'm not into like the splatter gore, and that tends to be what horror games tend to be like that, and it's quite frustrating because I feel like there's a real gap in the market for intelligent, involved storytelling that has a scary element to it, and I think we have a sort of real lack of that in general. I think in the movies and in games. What do you think, Alex?
I imagine.
Sorry, Gum.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say. I imagine like the perfect horror experience in game that I've seen and been through is The Last of Us Part 2, because that was the first. Not only as you think horror films, it's a horror, it's scary, it scares you. But The Last of Us Part 2 is horrifying. It really, you look at it and it's just horrific, the violence, the way it makes the violence feel. I've never experienced anything like that. That's what the horror genre can do. Because it reduces itself to so many films are just jump scares. You have quiet, go, oh, what was that? What was that? Oh, it's nothing. easy, and people like that. It's fun. Who cares? It's great. Can't argue with the success. But then the area for true, if I was to make a horror, like something of any kind, I'd want it to be horrifying.
Yeah.
That's where the depth can be, because the Last of Us Part 2, the zombies, they're just zombies going to zombie. You can't really impact what a zombie does.
Yeah.
But humans, God, the horrifying, like the horror is in humanity. That's where the depth can be, and then that means that because specifically the two main characters are both women. Put anyone into those situations, and then have the confidence to make that kind of experience, because that's where women can. You bring in the diverse side as well, and you'll see an entire new universe of stories that white men, it's not their story to tell sometimes, and that's okay.
Yeah. So what do you think,
Sorry,
Alex?
I'll call you then, Alex.
Yeah. Do you think that women getting more of a raw deal in horror games than
slightly more? I think it does depend on the specific type of horror game as well, obviously. But the ones that I've watched, like on YouTube, not played, I must hasten to add, the ones, well, I'm particularly thinking, and this will probably come into the next question, of one particular game. I wasn't sure if you classify it as horror, but Heavy Rain, the female characters in that are, well, the two that I can remember most well are either the naggy wife, who gets really depressed, obviously, after certain turns of events, and then one of the people who you question as the detective, who I think is a prostitute, and then obviously the third one, which I forgot to mention, whose profession I've completely forgotten, but all I remember is that there's a scene with a shower in it, and she's naked in it, and that's basically all I can remember. But it's mostly centred around, obviously, the male characters and their experiences and their stories a lot more. But in terms of when you compare it to other genres, I mean, we talk about it all the time. We feel like women are getting a raw deal everywhere, so it's difficult to say which is more or less of a raw deal.
Yeah.
But it does depend on the content and the particular stories that are being put across, whether they have more of a male focus or if they can be turned to more of a wider, more inclusive focus than one particular story. And I think horror just has tend to revolve around a lot of stereotypical or just, as Matt said, cheap thrills and just gore and jump scares, really. So there's not a lot of depth to it.
And it's so, with The Last of Us Part 2, the one of the baked in thing that really horrifies you is that the enemies call each other by their names because they know each other. So you go up behind someone and stab them in the throat, and the person, their friend over there, sees you and shouts, "Lucy, no!" And you go, "Oh fuck! I just killed an actual person." That's what it makes you feel, and that I reflect on, like the things that have a really powerful impact. For example, have either of you watched Squid Game?
Yeah.
Yeah, but I've watched the trailer.
You must.
Just finished it last night.
Is it good? Yeah, I've been meaning to.
Stunning. It's a
horrible.
visceral. Yeah, I was just going to say it's a visceral experience that you feel. It really makes you feel things, and just.
I'm trying to think what was similar that I've watched that was similar. I can't remember what it was called. It's going to really annoy me, but I'll think of it later and ask you if you watched it.
Yeah, that kind of just the horror is exhilarating, and just it's the kind of story that you can imagine yourself in that situation and think, "Oh God, what would I do then?" it makes you question yourself, question yourself and your moral center. Could you do those things? And that's it doesn't have to be violent to be horrifying. That's a very common, like you said, gore. There's gore porn and torture porn like Saw.
Yeah. I think that, again, it comes down to this sort of lazy writing that, you know, because you can kind of get away with it. I think that the tropes come out in force. And I think that's where women sort of suffer, because they all of the kind of cliches about, you know, women. And I think also, you know, what we're dealing with in the physical world at the moment is a sort of realization of the daily fear that women feel just walking about in the streets and you know, coming into contact with police and all of those things, and I think, you know, that it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because then if you just translate that into a horror game, then you're actually reinforcing and recreating real world horrors, which is easy because it's something that we have fundamentally inside us, but it's lazy because it doesn't explore the fact that there are lots of other opportunities to scare people and not just to scare people, but to make people think about the issues that are raised by sort of horror. And I have watched, like, Squid Game is a great example of that. You know, that it does make you think, what if I was in that situation? How would I think? It also makes you think about, you know, the issues around, you know, extreme debt and, you know, societies that run it with that system, and how such enormous inequalities in society, what that does to people at both ends of the scale, and they talk about this in that show. And I think, you know, and I know that it has set off people thinking about these issues in ways that maybe they hadn't thought about them. So it's a positive. It's yes, it's gory, yes, it's horrific, yes, it's scary, yes, it's fun, but it can also be, you know, a force for positive change, or at least positive thought.
Yes, you can't argue with success. And some things are extremely popular, some things are very popular. Then there are things like Squid Game, which are transcendently popular. And the only like other thing that it makes me think of is Avatar, the movie that just came up and then made nearly $3 billion, like the most successful film ever. And if you think, oh, well, looks like a lot of people looked at that. Then you look at what the message is. The message of Avatar is literally corporations come into a native land, colonizing it, and try and destroy the natives. And the natives fight back against the corporations and capitalism and the colonies, which is something that so much of the world has actually experienced, because no one looks at that and goes, the corporations are the good guys.
No.
And it's exactly the same with, so that's colonialism. And then Squid Game is capitalism. It's corrupt capitalism, because it's like, it was the top in 90 countries in the world, half the countries in the world. This was the top thing in history, like in terms of TV shows. And that's because everyone feels that crushing weight that corrupt capitalism is crushing down on everyone. And that's horrifying. That's horror. When you go, oh my God, look at how real that is. You could almost reach out and touch it.
Yeah.
That's truly good horror.
I remembered what the other Netflix series is that you should all watch. Maniac. If you haven't watched it yet, you should. I don't want to say too much about it because my friend recommended it to me with absolutely no spoilers and just said, watch it, go and watch it. And you should do that without knowing anything about it. It is equally gory. Well, not equally, but, you know, there is gore. And it does make you think a lot about things. I should watch it again, really, because it's just so good. But that's my recommendation. And I would definitely say that it's horror based. Yes.
Cool. Good. New recommendation, because I just finished Squid Game, so I need that. So with all of that in mind, I'm interested in what you feel is sort of the most depressing example of gender inequality in horror games at the moment. Yeah, Alex, do you want to?
Yeah, well, like my only answer I could think of was the one that came up most to me was just Heavy Rain. Again, I mentioned it previously, but thinking about the differences between the male characters and the female characters, and how the female characters are so obviously objectified or made out to be these negative forces in the main character's life. Although actually some of the other playable characters are ultimately the villains if you know the plot. But yeah, it just seems to lack any depth in terms of the female characters, at least anyway. And I just feel that, you know, it's just tired, you know, because there's so much more you could do with it. And yeah, I just don't think it's I don't think it's as good as it could be, certainly. Although it's quite an old game now, when you think about it. I mean, I don't know when it came out. It was quite a while ago, I think. I can't remember.
Yeah, I've not played it. It's not, and I don't know why. Is it a console game?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, but it's very similar to the sorts of ones. What's it called?
Isn't it kind of like what we just played?
Yeah, kind of like that.
Oh, okay.
Like where all your choices impact the end of the story, and there's like multiple routes you could go on. But essentially, it's about a dad losing one of his sons, and then losing his other son, and trying to find him ultimately, and trying to not let him be murdered. So it's really quite a dark and sad game anyway, really. It's quite depressing.
Yeah.
But, yeah, I just think the way that the female characters are portrayed is just completely lacking in depth, and it just paints them as a sort of you know, not as fundamental to the story as the male characters. Again, I could be totally wrong, and if people want to disagree with me, then they can. But, that's just the impression I got from spending time with that game. Yeah.
What about you, Matt? What's your most depressing example?
Well, I think a good way to describe it. So there's damning with faint praise, but there's also damning with faint exposure. So they're either not there, they're not even given the grace of existing in these projects, or they are shown so like with that picture we showed earlier, like cardboard cutouts of each other. So there's no richness. Then it's indicative of like society's view of women as a whole, that there's nothing interesting there. And when they are just absent from things,
or that the only interesting thing is their body.
Yeah, and if you don't get to see these rich female roles in horror films, then people aren't going to think there are those kinds of roles because there aren't. And so it's a problem that just cycles and repeats itself. I was looking at a documentary about the Medal of Honor in America, and there was a black sergeant in World War II, and I didn't know that in World War II the army was segregated. So the Americans fighting the Nazis, who were exterminating an entire race, had their army separated on racial grounds. And until 1944 or 45, black soldiers were not allowed to serve in combat units because there was the stereotype that they were cowards and terrible fighters, because of course that was the impression of them. But then after the Battle of the Bulge, they were desperate for more troops, so they made black only combat battalions, and of course they go in and serve just like any other soldier would in a combat unit. And then you get to see the richness come out, because they're in that opportunity. They have that opportunity, and a black soldier goes, and they had to, because black soldiers weren't allowed to be superiors to white soldiers. A lot of them had to take demotions in order to serve, and they did that willingly. And then that's where you see them bloom. You need to have people in the room and give them that opportunity to bloom. And that's what is denied women constantly. They are just, if you're not in the room, then you can't make an impact.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest thing for me, probably.
I think that's so important, and you know, and I think it's we talk about it all the time, don't we? You know, you've got to see it to be it, and you know, by not having people taking a chance on making actual deep and, you know, properly fleshed out, and I don't mean in you know in the ways that they so often are, but you know, female characters who have you know more than a 2D sort of backstory and are not there just simply to prop up the male lead would be what would be really lovely. I think one game for me which really stands out, and Matt and I have discussed this in a deep dive, is Resident Evil, The Village, and for reasons that we will hopefully get onto. I think that Resident Evil is such a staple part of the horror genre in gaming, and has certainly been something that I've always enjoyed throughout. And it does present some of the strongest female characters and some of the least problematic female characters. But in The Village, I felt that they really missed a massive trick, because the female characters that they have are very 2D, and it's all about this man trying to save his daughter. He's not even doesn't even seem that bothered about his wife. I mean, who dies right at the start of the game. So you know he's not that bothered about her, but he's bothered about saving his daughter, which is an issue that, you know, I think comes up in a lot of games. This idea of men going out to save somebody, but we'll come to that. But yeah, so I was disappointed, even though they have these characters that are quite respectable for female characters. But I think it's disappointing that they don't try harder. I think must try harder. So for me, that would be the most depressing example of a modern game.
And women. So there are shit films of any stripe, and they can be good fun. Unless like there are shit games of any type that are still good fun. If you're going to make a lazy shit game, you can literally separate it by write it and then make the main character a woman.
Yeah,
and it will stand out.
Yeah,
because there's a million shit films and shit games with a man at the heart of it. Just make that one change, and all of a sudden, that's progress. At least if you get the same as the worst that men get, that's a step forward. Because then you go, oh, there's that woman going to save her son. There's that woman going to save her. I don't think I've ever seen a movie where a woman goes to save their mum.
No, it's
always a son going to save. It's always a son or a husband.
Yeah.
So just make it a woman.
I'm going to come on to this. We are going to talk about this, and this is really interesting. So as I said, when I was thinking about this subject today, I was like, you know, how can we make it a little bit more quirky? You know, how can we come at it from a slightly different angle, and maybe uncover some new discussion areas really, and some issues around this. And I am slightly concerned that when you put all of this together, that what we end up with is, as I said earlier, a situation where horror games are actually perpetuating myths around the roles of men and the roles of women, the victimhood of women and the power, the violence of men, and that they're sort of glossing over the horror of the fact that this is the lived reality for many people, and something that society really has not got its head around and really is not tackling properly, despite what Priti Patel might say. And I think they're also sort of fetishizing the idea of violence against women and children. And so for me, I wanted to have to explore this evening a little bit about whether we feel that these horror games are actually in effect perpetuating toxic masculinity. Now, Matt, you said that toxic masculinity is something that you know quite a bit about. So I was wondering if you might be able to just explain a little bit, just in case people haven't come across the term or aren't quite sure what it means, and maybe see if you can relate it to what we're talking about this evening. Sorry, I didn't give you any preparation. I'm just dropping that on you. But
so my perspective on what toxic masculinity is the fantasy figure that like male superiority is meant to look like. You're meant to be strong. You're meant to be stoic. You're never supposed to be emotional. You're supposed to be calculating. You've got to be the breadwinner. You've got to be a hero. You've got to be special. You need to be able to work. You need to be physically strong. You need to be the head of the household, damn it. You need to make a woman. She will be yours, she will be your wife, and their children, they will be yours, and you will be in charge. And she will have your dinner on the table when you get home from work, God damn it, because you work really, really hard. And you've got to be powerful, you've got to be dominant over other men, you've got to be the strongest, loudest, proudest person in the room, and you've got to be just the best. That's what toxic masculinity, the message is. But then, so that's what leads to men feeling powerful and men being the leading cause of men. I think it's on the age of 35, the suicide rates. So either props you up to the preposterous levels of self-confidence and arrogance that our government displays, and also literally kills men. So I don't know if you noticed, but I've got a mutton chops moustache in honour of Movember, in case anyone's interested in that. I thought I'd just give it a go, and I look like a Victorian gentleman, especially with my bowler hat on. So if you take someone, they're wealthy, and they're a white man especially, and you send them to a boarding school where it's only people like you, and then you send them to university, and then they go wandering into the halls of power because that's where they are welcomed, and you fail your way up because you've been taught that you're the best. You should be here. You're awesome, and you deserve to be in charge, and you can do no wrong because you're awesome. That's what they get. What everyone else gets is don't cry. Never cry. It doesn't matter how sad you are. Don't talk about your feelings. The only feeling that you're allowed to feel are anger. And violence is okay, and boys will be boys, which means you do exactly what you want to do, all right? And girls and women, they are things to be hunted, and they owe you sex. That's where part of where incel comes from. It's the idea of women being an other. They're a thing. And then all of these things, like disabilities, if you can't work a normal job, and then that brings capitalism into it. What is a normal job? You work 40 hours a week until you die. And so maybe you can't do that. Maybe you're not the breadwinner. Maybe you're white. Maybe you lose your job and your wife gets a job. And then all of these things coalesce. You measure against this fantastical figure that is impossible to be, but the higher-ups, the elites, believe that they are with every fibre of their being. And then that is what crushes the other men in the system. So it's both a matter of saying this is what you should be and this is what you are, and the shame of that it brings. And then that leads to anger, which leads to violence, which is why men commit so much violence. And it's one of the core pillars of the patriarchy, because it dictates what men's behavior is. And so that's what is displayed everywhere. That's the message that is sent, because that's how the patriarchy perpetuates itself. I went off on one then because I hadn't thought.
No,
because if you'd told me you were going to dump that on me, I probably would have been more concise. But that's
I think that's
a subject I'm very passionate about, because it kills us.
Yeah,
it kills us. That's why we need to have a very honest conversation about it.
So
absolutely. So with all of that in mind, do you feel that how do you feel that horror games interact with that toxic masculinity? I mean, I feel like that's a bit of a non-question now, because I feel like you've kind of answered that. But is there anything that well, I mean, Alex, do you want to come in here? Is there anything that you would like to sort of add to that?
When you were talking about it, all I kept thinking about was a particular storyline in LA Noire, when you're on the homicide desk, and it's all about a series of a serial killer, essentially, who just goes after women, and it's based on a real serial killer from the 1940s in LA, the Black Dahlia. So it is in effect romanticising true events, and the character you play, Cole, ends up conquering said murderer, and it's just the dynamic between the two is that basically the guy who commits all the murders is a barman that's involved in each of the cases, and he obviously feels that he wants to make a name for himself and wants to be remembered as this murderer and this person that outwitted the police for so long, and what his thinking was behind that was the reason is because probably of toxic masculinity and feeling that he's not top of the pile and no one is noticing him, and that women owe him this ability to be, so that he can be superior to these women and control them. And he would often write messages on their bodies and all sorts of horrible things. And your job was to basically treat it as a puzzle to be solved, which was I must admit, obviously I think it's a good game, but also it has many flaws because it's representing a time in which women were so much more oppressed than they are now. And it's obviously a truer reflection of that time, which is sometimes difficult to process, obviously, when you're playing it from a modern perspective as well. I mean, that opens up a whole another can of worms about whether playing games set in particular histories, should we be playing them because they're accurate to that history, or should we just not play them at all because they're just not representative and not inclusive, and they're perpetuating these things. But that's a whole nother conversation.
I think that is a whole nother episode, isn't it?
But yeah, I mean, in terms of other ways that toxic masculinity rears its ugly head, I would say that in terms of horror, it's interesting to think about how can men be scared? Can men be shown as being afraid? And how often are they scared and afraid in these horror games when they are the central characters?
Yeah.
That's an interesting aspect to think about, I think.
I've been thinking recently about so there's the idea of the alpha male. Every man is supposed to be an alpha male, but that's impossible. Because an alpha male, we had alpha males when we were on the fucking plains, and you needed to be the strongest in order to lead the group. But we are thousands of years of societal development later, and we're still saying, no, we want to be the alpha male. And Daniel, can you see on the chat?
Yeah.
So toxic masculinity is tricky to get people to accept, since when you spell it out, it sounds crazy and men don't want to identify with that. Because you tell yourself, I'm an alpha male and I'm special because I am an alpha male. But then someone comes up to you and says, look, the honest truth is you're not special. You've been given privilege. You're just as equal as the rest of us. To a lot of people, especially people with tons of power, it says their ego comes in head of everything. If you said to Boris Johnson, the only reason you're here is because you failed upwards, you're upper class, all of these other incredibly privileged characteristics. You either get humbled and go, oh yes, I do feel that like that. That is true. But you can just go, that's a load of bollocks. I'm here because I'm the best, because I am an alpha male.
And it's asking a lot to expect people to go and completely unpick everything they've understood about themselves, and to accept that, that they only got where they got because they happened to have been born into the right part of the world, to the right family, and have had opportunities presented to them, rather than what they've been told all their life, which is that they're special and that they worked really hard and they deserve what they have. I can understand that that's challenging for people, and I think privilege is another whole issue, and it's one of my pet areas. But I think it is a complicated topic, but I think there's a big misunderstanding about it, that when you say that somebody's privileged, you're not having a go at them. You're just saying, just recognize that you might have what you have through pure chance, through luck, through whatever, and it isn't that you somehow have some innate deservingness for that. I'm really conscious.
It's all about.
No, go on, Matt.
I was going to say it all revolves around your ego, because if you can sort of view ego is never a good thing, I don't think, because it either tells you you're the best and demands that you live up to that, or it tells you you're not the best. And it's always ego is a measuring stick. How much am I on this measuring stick? And the measuring stick needs to be thrown away entirely, because toxic masculinity is a cage. And once you're out of the cage, you can try and find your authentic self. And that's where the ego doesn't matter anymore, because you're being you and you feel that way. But when you say someone bringing up the topic of toxic masculinity, it feels like an attack. That's why men instantly shut down when anything about violence against women is brought up. But go, no, it's not about you. It's not saying it's not about you. It's about everyone.
Yeah.
And you can be perfectly happy and thriving with everyone else, and telling everyone, no one's special. Either everyone's special or no one's special. And just relax.
As Daniel says, that the argument is that I make 100 times more since I work 10 times harder for 240 hours a day. Yeah, we know that's not true. We know that the way we value things in society is very skewed. So thinking about toxic masculinity, I came across this excellent research piece. I think it's like an article. I'm not sure. We will find a way to link to it somewhere. But it's called Your Daughter is in Another Castle. And it's looking at essential paternal masculinity in video games. It's by somebody called Shannon Lawler. And I just came across this when I was doing some research for today. And in it, she talks about somebody called, where has he gone? It's in my questions. Stephen Totillo, who is a writer and researcher. And he wrote an article back in 2010 about the daddening of video games. And I thought this was really interesting. So in her piece, Shannon talks about, she specifically looks at The Last of Us, the first one, and BioShock, and the Walking Dead games. Now, I have played the Walking Dead games, and I played the first Last of Us, and I own the second Last of Us. I got it last week, so I'm really looking forward to playing that. But I haven't played by any of the BioShock series, so I'm just having to take her word for it. But she's looking at the relationship, the way that men are portrayed in these games, and how they are portrayed in relationship to the women in the games, which was really interesting. So the daddening of video games is referencing the increase in paternal masculinity, which we see in games, where they're the sort of father figure, and their job is to rescue a child, usually a female child, generally. Their role is basically to protect this child. Now, where it becomes potentially problematic is that it is almost always with extreme violence, and I think, as Matt's described the issues around toxic masculinity, this idea that in order to be a father figure, you have to basically go out and beat the crap out of anyone who threatens your family or your children, and you have to put yourself through utter hell at all costs to rescue them, and I think is extremely problematic, actually. And I think, what's really interesting is that I think on the surface, I actually would have do still put The Walking Dead and The Last of Us as positive horror games, but this sort of retelling of those stories and some of the issues that are involved with them has been really interesting for me to kind of consider what's going on under the surface. And I think we see a similar daddening happening in the Resident Evil, The Village, where he is going through hell, almost literally, to save his daughter. And the wife is almost just chucked out the window, but the daughter is the priority. And she also talks about how there's very little parenting that goes on in these games. So although there's this protecting, there isn't the parenting. They're not actually, they're not caring. I do want to sort of say that there was an example in The Walking Dead, in those games, where he has to cut her hair, and he has to feeds her, he has to make choices as to whether or not he's going to give her his food and things. So there is a little bit of caring going on in that game, but in the others, it's not really that. And so it's a very narrow perspective of what are these dad roles, and we don't, as you said earlier, Alex, we don't see, I can't think of a single example of a woman going after.
I actually just thought of one. It is in very late on in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. If you play, I think it's in the DLC, Cassandra does become a mum, and you have to save your son and or husband, and I actually didn't like it. But I think that's because I spent over 100 hours playing Cassandra as just a woman being all badass and like with no family to protect.
Yeah.
And suddenly she suddenly had a family randomly, and I was just like, well, this doesn't seem to fit with the character that I've been playing for over 100 hours. So I had a weird reaction to it. I felt quite underwhelmed and weird about it, but it very much. The husband was very much he had like no personality other than falling in love with Cassandra and just being a dad, basically. And then there was just no depth to him whatsoever. So it was essentially like a gender reversal.
Yeah.
It was just copy and paste one and the other.
Yeah.
And Cassandra did resort to violence to rescue her family. Doesn't succeed in rescuing all of them, but violence was very much part of that story. But literally, I've just thought of it as we were talking. But no, I can't think of any other mums in games that would
No. I mean, I'm just going to show a picture of The Last of Us that I thought was quite gives a good example, really, of what we're describing. You know, he's protecting her, and actually, in the game, she's Ellie's quite capable of looking after herself when she needs to. So, Matt, can you think of any examples of this sort of?
I have many things to say. So this daddening is a phenomenon that is crossing all media forms of the gruff, emotionally distant father figure to a emotional young child who he desperately wants to connect with, but he just doesn't know how. That's what Tom's just put in a comment about God of War. So,
I was literally just going to bring that up, but yeah.
And so it's exactly the same with The Witcher.
Oh my gosh, yes, I completely forgot. Cool.
Say again?
I completely forgot about The Witcher, of course.
Yeah. And there's The Mandalorian as well. These laconic, dry-witted, incredibly violent men. And that comes back into toxic masculinity because it tells every man that you're special. You are special. And the women, they do all the nappies, feeding, cleaning, school, everything. And then you come in and you're the hero. When they get kidnapped, you go and rescue them. That's what parenting is. It's one-off things that fathers are told they're supposed to do. They're supposed to come in, and when you said there's the trope of you see a man holding his baby in the park, you think, oh, he's such a good father. When this just. So it's such a good point about the violence, that's how you show love is through violence. And violence is fun, and the really good games like Last of Us and God of War, they capture that thing of what would you do in this situation to care for your child. I think most would go, I would kill 1 million people if they stood between me and my child. And if a game can get you to feel that, then that's really good. My theory behind why this daddening is happening is because in the earlier days of game development, it was younger men making games that they wanted to see and play, and they wanted go and save the princess games, save the damsel in distress, and then she'll fall in love with you. That's what they wanted. But then they got older, they had families, and they go, oh my God, children, there's a parental connection. Fathers have parental feelings about their children. I can't believe it. The emotion that I feel when my child, I would do anything. Has anyone ever felt like that before? And then that's what happens. It's because they grow up, and now everything is being made by middle-aged men about middle-aged men. And you know how much I hate Christopher Nolan now. His next film is about Oppenheimer and the nuclear bomb. And it goes, oh, it's Robert Downey Jr. and Matt Damon and Cillian Murphy, who are all great, but it's going to be another great big wank fest about how incredible middle-aged men are.
Men are, yeah.
And how women it's that damning by faith exposure of just, I'm just going to have them. I'm so revolutionary, but I can't write one woman character.
I think what's also interesting is that one of the other things that this article went on to talk about was actually also about this idea of the idealized girlhood and monstrous mothers. That's what she called the section, and which I think is a brilliant heading. And she talks about how the little girls. So I'm just going to show some pictures. So we have Clementine from The Walking Dead here. She's very cute. And then we have Ellie. She's also very cute. And I'm not so sure that the Bioshock little girl is cute. I don't know. I think it depends on your idea. But what she talks about is how it's so important that these little girls that are being rescued by these big men are cute, that they kind of, she talks about how they chuck out a lot of like the uncomfortable and awkward and difficult femininity, and they sort of, but they keep enough to make them appealing and to make it sort of like, you know, well, who couldn't rescue this small girl? You know, no one but a soulless creature could do this. So, and she also counters that by talking about the women, the female characters that appear in a lot of these games, where the female characters are the sort of polar opposite of this. They're horrific. They're mad. They're controlling. They're aggressive. I mean, again, Matt and I talked a bit about what's her name, Mother Miranda. From The Village, and she just is, you know, the reality is she's traumatized by horrible grief at the loss of her child, but you know what we end up with is this horrible monstrous creature who's gone to extreme lengths, and it's very unreasonable of her to do that. And I think, you know, we have these extremes where, you know, women are to be protected and cared for as long as they are cute and innocent and, you know, do what they're told, and, you know, but also as long as they are useful to the men that are, you know, protecting them in some way. And I think from that perspective, I feel like we're reinforcing this toxic masculinity and these negative gender stereotypes. Anyway, I'm going to stop banging on about that. And
Can I make one more quick point?
Yeah.
Of what you were saying about how like it's like the ideal victim like stereotype. Like if you are
exactly,
if a woman is sexually assaulted, then there is a set like blueprint of the optimal victim that if you don't fit that, then you are even more less likely to get any form of justice. And it's the same with those little girls. They are props to be had, because if you put a real woman in if you just took an average woman off the street and put them into a game, or say a horror game for this example, and just as a real person, they would make the heroes look like fucking morons. Because real women make men look bad if they are exposed to them. It's the thing of, if you've got 10 men writing the thing that they think is the best thing, and you put a black woman in and says, you know, this has only got white men in it. Do you think that might be a bit boring because every single film has always been like that forever? That makes it makes them feel like they're not special. They're not the alphas. And so that's why they go with these tropes, because they go, if we took the time to make a fleshed out, interesting character, she would say, why are you doing this? Why did Chris just not tell Ethan what the plan was? Why did he just not check if the person who they said was dead? Why didn't they have this plan? Because just if you just put them there and just put them in the room, they'd make the men look bad. Yeah. And so men just go, the tropes are fine, because that's what real women are like. And
I think I'm gonna bring it back to this idea that this is just perpetuating these issues and fetishizing the whole idea of violence against women and girls. Because, you know, I've been researching the Reclaim the Night today, and you know, the first Reclaim the Night marches happened in the UK in 1977, up in, well, all across the country, but they were as a result of the lack of police engagement in the crimes of the Yorkshire Ripper, because the first victims were prostitutes, or at least thought to be prostitutes, and it wasn't until a college student was attacked that they got involved. And and yet we are seeing, like 44 years later, we are seeing the same issues coming up in recent crimes and recent events with the police, that that they're not, that some people's lives are more valuable than others, and there's this idea that there is like you say, a idealized victim and somebody who, and I think that what we're seeing is that is being recreated in the horror games genre. The question obviously is it art imitating reality, or is it reality imitating art? And how much of that is and I think that, as you said, Matt, like if we could get more representation and more positive representation into the gaming world, then I feel that would have a positive knock-on effect into the real world. So we're like really up against it now, because we've already done our hour, so we should just go now. But I'm not Caroline, so we'll overrun a little bit. But I just want to ask you, so we're to end on a positive note. So what I would like to know is, what do you think is the game with the horror game with the best gender representation? Accepting that we've kind of got all around the houses tonight, so we might have undermined some of our choices. Alex, do you want to?
Well, I think that answer is very easy for me, and it's a game that I haven't played, but I have watched all the way through on YouTube, because that's what I tend to do with horror games anyway, is I just watch them. And it's Last of Us 2, because I haven't seen anything like it before or since.
Oh, have you watched some of it?
Yeah. Sorry, Matt. What did you say?
Have you watched some of it?
Oh, yeah, I've watched all of it,
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, we must do a deep dive. Deep dive.
Yeah. No, I just think it's, there's basically two female leads, and they're both equally different, and they're both in grey areas. You don't know whether they're good or bad. You're forced to try and decide. Well, you're not forced, but you question whether what you're doing is really right, and whether what a character you thought was bad to begin with is are they actually a little bit good, or is it okay for them to be a mix of both? And it just really makes you think about how you would feel in these situations. Like you said, Matt, it makes you think about how you would react and what you would do if you were on that side or this side. And it just makes you think about the human experience and how terrifying that is. And I think it's really great. So, yes, I would agree.
That last thing you said about the horror of the real world.
Yeah. That's
another thing that... because I was just thinking, like, when we were talking about the pub games and how you and Jem, you and Caroline talked about being groped, and the general threat that we're under constantly, that's real horror. There is so much horror just out there in the world. You don't need to make it up. And if you had three women in a writing room and that you just went, okay, tell your scariest story of what you've experienced in terms of threat or violence or any of that. And that would be more terrifying than anything a random group of 10 men could come up with, I guarantee. So there's so much to it be explored. And then it just needs to be shown. People need to see it. They need to see it to understand it. Do you want to go with your one, or should I go with mine?
With what? Which one? Sorry?
Your answer to the question. That was a side note from me responding to Alex. So,
yeah, go with yours.
So, as you've already said, The Last of Us Part 2. I will go with. I went through the Wikipedia list of horror games, and took like 10 of them. I think after The Last of Us Part 2, probably the next best one is called Plague Tale: Innocence.
Yes, yeah.
Really good game. This is about a young teenage girl and her even younger brother trying to survive this horrific plague in the Black Death in France. And she is the acting in it is incredible. And you really feel, it's called Innocence for a reason. You feel that, and you also feel just the authenticity of it. That's what does it justice. And there's also that their mum is an alchemist, and not just a mother. But there's it always seems to come into like family. A woman character is always bound by some kind of family tie, but that is a particularly good representation.
Yeah, I've seen that. I mean, it's topped quite a lot of the charts as well on sort of strong female characters. I haven't played it, but it's one of the ones I do really want to play. And I think also it's interesting because it's a sibling relationship. So there's a different layer there. I think for me, I was going to say Walking Dead, because I think that is a really good series, and I do think it is the characters are very well fleshed out, and I think gender isn't a priority there. It's not. You're not that women aren't just women; they are people. But I also really want to say the game that we played, Little Hope, and The Man from Medan. I thought both of those were very good horror films with women just being women. I had slight issue in The Man from Medan because the two women in there were wearing very short shorts, but they were on a boat, and it was part of the scene. And I don't think it's not always got to be about have to be fully covered up in order to be an acceptable to a feminist. And I think that's that's the myth that we need to get rid of. But so I felt like there wasn't any a gratuitous sexism in it. There wasn't any. They were all quite capable of looking after themselves, and they all had their own personalities and their own stories. So I felt that they were good examples of where gender inequality is not a massive factor in the game itself. I mean, it is in society, and that always overflows. And we have got through so much this evening. There's so much more that I think we could have talked about. I've got loads of pictures and things that we didn't use. But what I wanted to do was just ask our viewers, really, anyone who wants to have an opinion on this, is I think that I'd be really interested to know, going forward, do you think that we can do good horror stories by without losing the useful shorthand of the stereotypes and the tropes, but without perpetuating these negative stereotypes, these negative issues, and that's so. I just want everyone to kind of go away and think about that. Really, that's your homework. We don't have time for a wildcard question. We don't have time for any of that. You were right, Matt. We didn't have time. So I think that's it. Unless anyone's got anything they would like to add, is there anything that you feel you desperately need to say that you haven't said?
Just that I've been watching two shows, Deadwood and Ripper Street, and this comes into a couple of games as well. There's the archetype of the noble degenerate, of someone who's very high and very esteemed and powerful and good and noble, but then they always go and shag prostitutes and traffic women, and it's always something to do with the women that's there. That's just side thing. So yes, I want to enter noble degenerate into the record.
Noble degenerate, yeah. Okay then. Right. Well, we've been spooking the system and gaming the system, and thank you for joining us. And we are live every other Thursday, and we're putting stuff out on Tuesdays and Thursdays now. I think we are. So we're doing deep dives into various games, and we've got bonus material of all sorts of fun and games. So if there's something you'd like us to talk about, do let us know. Please do like and share and comment and ring bells and follow us and whatever, everything. Just tell your friends. One podcast I listened to says, just share us with 3 of your friends. If you like what you see, just send it to 3 friends. So and thank you ever so much for joining us this evening. Goodbye.
We hope you enjoyed that episode of Gaming the System. If you want to support us, you can donate to us through our PayPal by sending it to wearegamingthesystem@gmail.com if you want to send us a one-off donation. If you want to donate to us monthly, you can subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/gamingthesystem. Until next time, bye-bye.